In May of 1939, the SS St. Louis set sail from Europe, bringing over 900 Jews to the Western Hemisphere, seeking refuge from the Nazis. But no matter which port they stopped at, they were not allowed to disembark. Nobody wanted to give them sanctuary. Even the United States, whose Statue of Liberty bears a poem proclaiming it the Mother of Exiles, denied them entry. The ship would be forced to return to Europe, where 254 of its passengers would eventually meet their ends in the Holocaust. For Jews who had no place to go, a Jewish state, Herzl's dream and Balfour's promise, was more critically necessary than it had ever been before. The creation of a Jewish state was now literally a matter of life and death. World War II and the Holocaust are frequently cited as justifications for the creation of the State of Israel. But as I have made it abundantly clear in previous videos, the Zionist project predates all of that by a long shot. But what World War II did do was generate international sympathy for the Zionist cause, as well as test the mettle of the institutions that would eventually become the Israeli government. And that's the story I want to tell today. In spring of 1939, after nearly 3 years of revolt in Mandatory Palestine, the British government issued a white paper that drastically curtailed the potential growth of the Jewish population, capping the number of annual Jewish immigrants to 15,000 for the next 5 years, after which no more would be allowed. With war on the horizon in Europe, Whitehall and Downing Street could ill afford to deal with another mob of anti-Semites in the Middle East. So they threw the Zionists under the bus, knowing full well that they would never support the Axis powers over the Allies.
Despite the escalating persecution and murder of Jews in Austria and Germany, the British decided that the time was ripe, after all, for finally slamming Palestine's gates shut. The Chamberlain government gave way to Arab blackmail in much the same fashion that it was giving way to the Nazis. If appeasement was the solution to the problem of Czechoslovakia, then it could certainly serve the same purpose in Palestine.
The white paper became controversial amongst all three parties in the dispute. The Mandate government itself issued a statement declaring the white paper a violation of the Mandate's intended purpose. Members of the House of Commons from both the Conservative and Labour parties declared it a breach of faith. The Arabs had a split reaction to the white paper. The Arab side of the London Conference had multiple delegates representing the Arab states, as well as representing the Arabs of Palestine. The Palestine delegation, headed by Ani Abd al-Hadi, mostly approved of the white paper, believing it was the best they could get from the British at the time. And although the Arab states had their own interests in the region, they ultimately decided to leave the decision on whether to endorse the white paper to the Palestinian delegation. The one thing standing in their way was the Grand Mufti Amin al-Husseini. The Palestinian street was overjoyed, but al-Husseini, as was the Palestinian wont, managed to pluck defeat from the jaws of victory. Instead of welcoming the British move, al-Husseini and his colleagues rejected the white paper. They flatly demanded full cessation of Jewish immigration, immediate British withdrawal, and immediate independence. The Palestinians had a chance to get exactly what they wanted. The white paper promised an independent Palestine within 10 years, with the Jewish population capped at 1/3, and its parliament and therefore its immigration policy controlled by the Arabs. And with the majority of the population supporting the white paper, the British would have gladly supported the creation of an Arab majority state that could deal with the Jews as they saw fit. But that wasn't enough for the Mufti, who demanded everything he wanted right here, right now, with the only strings attached tied to the necks of those dirty Jews. And so because of this, the Arab delegations rejected the white paper. But the Mufti wasn't done making the lives of Arabs miserable. After the revolt, the Mufti enacted vengeance on traitors in the Arab and Muslim communities. He published lists of names of people known or suspected of collaborating with the British or the Zionists. He went so far as to place bounties on their heads, offering £100 for the heads of traitors, but only offering £10 for the heads of Jews. And these assassinations would continue after the war broke out in Europe. Despite this, numerous Arab notables were interested in restoring peaceful and profitable relations with their Jewish neighbors. The Nashashibi family restored their relations with the Jews in the summer of 1939, with the Fahum and Azizi families following suit in the fall. The Mufti of Haifa, Abdullah Tahoub, asking the Jewish Agency to help create a similar Arab organization. And in the summer of 1940, Jewish soccer teams began playing matches against local Arab teams. The Jewish Agency kept tabs on all of the business relationships between the Jewish and Arab communities, hoping to use them to gather intelligence on potential threats. Their intelligence service, SHI, would recruit Arab informers to report on the attitudes of their communities and report on the location of former rebels still evading capture by the British. The agency's Arab Bureau, headed by al-Husseini, would encourage Jewish businessmen to hire more Arab workers. The informer's economic dependence is the most convenient way, arrange a regular job for him as a guard, use him as a construction subcontractor, and give him preference over others, partnership in planting fields, medical assistance in cases of distress, and so on. Palestine was mostly peaceful during the war, due in large part to the Arabs believing they had finally gotten the upper hand over the Zionists thanks to the White Paper. The Zionists themselves, quite obviously, were appalled at the White Paper, as if the British had just signed the death warrant for millions of Jews in Europe. In August of 1939, the Zionist Congress met in Geneva, where the White Paper was their primary topic of conversation. We met under the shadow of the White Paper, which threatened the destruction of the national home, and under the shadow of a war which threatened the destruction of all human liberties, perhaps of humanity itself. The head of the Jewish agency, David Ben-Gurion, had allegedly been told by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain that the White Paper was a temporary policy that would be lifted after the threat of war in Europe had passed. But both the Jews and Arabs would seek to undermine the White Paper. There was still public support for Zionism, as well as the head of the opposition Labour Party, Clement Attlee, in addition to conservative firebrand Winston Churchill. Despite this, the British policy of minimizing Jewish self-sufficiency would continue, with weapons possession made illegal and the Haganah being labeled as terrorists. And although the Zionists were justifiably angry for the borders of Palestine being closed to Jewish refugees, that doesn't mean there wasn't at least a little bit of cynicism in their lobbying. Ben-Gurion and Chaim Weizmann, the president of the World Zionist Organization, would spend much of the war lobbying London, as well as governments of the world, to pressure Britain into reopening Palestine, but they didn't spend too much time asking these countries to open their own borders to Jewish refugees, even if only temporarily. If I knew it was possible to save all the children of Germany by their transfer to England, and only half of them by transferring them to Eretz Yisrael, I would choose the latter, because we are faced not only with the accounting of these children, but also with the historical accounting of the Jewish people. Fact of the matter is, Ben-Gurion and other Zionist leaders feared for the Jews of Europe not just out of concern for their fellow man or co-religionists, but because they saw European Jewry as the primary supply of money and manpower for the Zionist project. And the eradication of the third of the world's Jews would be devastating to a future Jewish state. For their part, the Allies justified keeping their borders closed in order to prevent Nazi saboteurs from entering their countries. For the British in particular, they like to repeat the claim that the Germans would sneak agents into the Middle East to rile up another revolt, turning the Arabs into a fifth column for the Axis powers. And so they saw their continued enforcement of the White Paper as not only preventing another rebellion against Jewish immigration, but also as preventing a Nazi-fomented revolt. But the Nazis wouldn't need to foment a revolt in Palestine to start a war, they just needed to make a couple treaties. Hitler and the Nazis had a tendency to use democratic rhetoric to justify their foreign policy, from annexing the Sudetenland in Austria to invading Poland. They even had the nerve to criticize the Western democracies for imperialist hypocrisy. I have taken the trouble to ascertain from the states mentioned, firstly, whether they feel themselves threatened, and secondly and above all, whether this inquiry by the American president was addressed to us at their suggestion, or at any rate, with their consent. The reply was in all causes negative. It is true that I could not cause inquiries to be made of certain of the states and nations mentioned because they themselves, as for example Syria, are at present not in possession of their freedom, but are occupied and consequently deprived of their rights by the military agents of democratic states. This anti-imperialist rhetoric certainly didn't hurt in their secret talks with the Soviets that led to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. During their talks, Ribbentrop tried to trade spheres of influence in Egypt for more territory in Europe, with Ribbentrop suggesting the Soviets should seek a warm water port in the Persian Gulf or Arabian Sea, which seems to imply that the Nazis didn't have much interest in the Middle East. Though apparently, as the talks went on and the Soviets decided to take up the Germans on their offer, Hitler got upset. Just as the Nazis began using the rhetoric of anti-imperialism to justify expansionism, the Soviet Union became increasingly anti-Semitic under the reign of Stalin, who curtailed the cultural rights of Jews and other ethnic minorities. In the Soviet Union, Judaism was recognized as a religion, not an ethnicity, which meant they had no rights to cultural autonomy. But this resulted in the Jews never being able to fully integrate into the Soviet society, forever set apart by their Judaism, while never being able to become fully Russian. After the pact was signed and the war began, the Soviets would target Zionist organizations in Poland, the Baltics, and Bessarabia, as well as Jewish socialist groups who were deemed not to be enthusiastic enough about Soviet communism. Stalin would ease up on the Jews slightly after the pact fell apart in 1941, tolerating a limited Jewish cultural revival, but only insofar as their activity was directed against the Nazis. The British, on the other hand, were reluctant to allow Zionists to aid the war effort. 2 days after the invasion of Poland, the Jewish Agency would declare their allegiance to the British. At this fateful moment, the Jewish community has a threefold concern: the protection of the Jewish homeland, the welfare of the Jewish people, the victory of the British Empire. The war which has now been forced upon Great Britain by Nazi Germany is our war, and all the assistance we shall be able and permitted to give to the British Army and the British people, we shall render wholeheartedly. And if you read anything about Zionism during World War II, you've come across this quote from David Ben-Gurion. "We will fight with the British against Hitler as if there were no white paper. We will fight the white paper as if there was no war." The Jewish Agency and the Labor Zionists would be joined by the revisionists and the Irgun in making a truce with the British to fight the Nazis. Zev Jabotinsky would publish The Jewish War Front in early 1940, bringing attention to the atrocities committed against the Jews of Poland and insisting that the Jews were an integral part of the war effort. Jabotinsky argued that the creation of a Jewish state should be made an explicit goal of the Allied war, with the Labor Zionists hoping that their contributions to the war would win them the retraction of the white paper. The Jewish community of Palestine was eager to support the war effort, but the British feared the Zionists receiving credit for defeating Hitler would anger the Arabs. In spite of this, the economy of Palestine would be mobilized for the war, seeing farmland expanded by 70% and the number of factories tripling by 1945. The war at sea in 1939 had seen an initial shrinking in exports from Palestine, but 1940 would see a boom, as the British began using the Mandate as a supply depot for the Eastern Mediterranean, using Jewish-owned factories to produce munitions, and increasing the export of citrus fruits. But more than economic support, the Zionists wanted to fight the Axis on the front lines. The Jewish Agency wanted to create a separate Jewish fighting unit, and they managed to recruit over 130,000 volunteers for military service, nearly a third of the Jewish population of Palestine. But the British were resistant, fearing that a Jewish brigade would form the core of a future Jewish army that the Zionists might use against the Arabs or even the British themselves. Even after Winston Churchill took over as Prime Minister in May 1940, getting the British to approve of a distinctly Jewish unit was like pulling teeth. Churchill himself had been a major supporter of Zionism, and during his early months in office, especially during the Battle of France, he was constantly advocating for the creation of a Jewish brigade to defend Palestine so British soldiers stationed there could be redeployed to England and France. But even Churchill had trouble getting his ministers and generals to go along with it. It wasn't until late 1941 that the Palestine Regiment was created, but this regiment would have recruitment quotas mandating equal numbers of Arabs and Jews be enlisted. Due to the significantly lower Arab support for the war, it was difficult to fill the Arab quota, and so Jews enlisted beyond the quota would be sent to Egypt to serve in non-Jewish units. There was an initial approval for the creation of a Jewish brigade by the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Lord George Lloyd. However, he died in February 1941 and would be succeeded by Walter Guinness, the Baron of Moyne, who quickly earned a reputation for anti-Semitism amongst the Zionists and members of Parliament. Let's put a pin in this story because it becomes relevant again later. Shortly after becoming colonial secretary, Lord Moyne would rescind the order to recruit Jewish units. While the Jews were offering their enthusiastic support to defeat the Nazis, Arab support was rather muted. Arab sympathy for the Axis powers would prevent the High Commissioner for Palestine, Harold McMichael, from appointing Arabs in charge of government departments as the White Paper instructed. But that's not to say there was no support. Local Arab leaders had begun the process of rebuilding relationships with local Jewish leaders after the revolt, with some working with the British and Zionists to hunt down Arab rebels. The revolt had devastated the economy of Palestine, especially for the Arabs, who feared German victory would reignite the war and bring more ruin. To prevent this, 5 Arab leaders would form a compact with the Jewish Agency in the summer of 1940, while the Abd al-Hadi family would utilize its forces to respond to attacks on Jewish settlements, as well as orchestrating assassinations of their political rivals. The Grand Mufti had even lost the support of several prominent Palestinian nationalists throughout the rebellion and its aftermath. Sheikh Fazi al-Imam was a preacher in a mosque in Jaffa until the Mufti removed him from his office, and so during the war he would preach against the Nazis, and was recruited by the Arab Bureau to report on the mood of the Arabs, as well as providing a list of imams who were giving pro-Nazi sermons. Abd al-Qadir al-Muzaffar would work with the Jewish Agency's Arab Bureau, while advising the British to isolate the Mufti's remaining supporters. However, the British also rebuffed Arab support as well. The Mandate government would ostracize the Nashashibi family, who had pledged their loyalty to the British war effort. Instead of isolating the Mufti's supporters, as Muzaffar had suggested, they instead tried to win the support of the Mufti's followers by appointing many of them to the Islamic religious hierarchy of Palestine. Not only that, but the British would also offer al-Husseini amnesty for the revolt if he would endorse the White Paper, which he refused to do. Although the Mufti's former followers were willing to give advice on how to deal with the Mufti's most zealous acolytes, they were hesitant in delivering any information about other former Arab rebels. Muzaffar was hesitant to deliver intelligence on Nazi collaborators, partly out of fear that this information would be used against the Arabs after the war in order to justify the creation of a Jewish state. Another informer who had followed the Mufti to Iraq, Ahmad al-Imam, would only deliver information on rebels he felt personally worried about, all the while trying to get the British to release numerous Arab prisoners. Muzaffar publicly warned against publicly revealing Nazi collaborators, fearing it would only make them and their families heroes amongst the Arabs. What would ultimately change the mind of British policymakers would be worsening fortunes on the battlefield. The British would ease up on the Haganah after the fall of France, and with them creating an official unit, the Palmach, who were tasked with protecting Jewish settlements from Arab raiders and to wage a guerrilla war against the Germans in the event Egypt fell to Axis forces. The Palmach was led and trained by Yigal Allon and Moshe Dayan, the latter of whom spent time at Acre prison after being arrested during a Haganah training camp, where the captives would be violently intimidated by the British. It was no doubt by design that the interrogation room was close enough for us to hear something of what was going on. We heard voices, then the sound of blows, followed by the moaning of someone in pain, then more talk and more groaning. It was only later that I heard from Zvi that he had been kicked and beaten, revived, and then beaten again because he refused to answer questions. Dayan and other Haganah members would be released in February 1941 and were quickly recruited into the Palmach. The fall of France had made the Arabs believe the British could be defeated with German help. 1 month into the war, Amin al-Husseini escaped his house arrest in Beirut, making his way to Baghdad, which also had a sizable Palestinian exile community. From there, he would first reach out to Germany, asking an assistant to deliver a letter to the German ambassador in Ankara. As the Allies continued to face setbacks in late 1939, the Mufti would send agents into Palestine, hoping to spark another rebellion on the anniversary of the Nabi Musa riots he had incited 20 years earlier. The Mufti's supporters began to spread rumors that the Germans promised to make the Mufti the head of a new Arab government in Palestine. In May of 1940, Iraq's foreign minister, Nuri as-Said, demanded that London issue a statement guaranteeing an Arab government in Palestine after the war. A draft statement was written, but the newly sworn-in Winston Churchill would squash it. In April 1941, after a year of rejecting demands from the British to cut ties with fascist Italy, former Prime Minister Rashid Ali al-Ghayani orchestrated a coup in Baghdad, removing Prime Minister Nuri Said from power and Abd Allah from the regency of the young king Faisal II. The German government pledged support to Iraq, while Stalin, in observance of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, also recognized Rashid's regime. Germany would deploy a squadron of fighters to Iraq via Vichy-controlled Beirut. The Mufti had supported Rashid's efforts by energizing the Palestinian exile community in their support, as well as issuing a fatwa calling for a jihad against the British. Rashid received additional support from the future founders of the Ba'ath Party, who formed the Society to Help Iraq in Damascus. We were racists, admiring Nazis, reading its books and the sources of its thought, particularly Nietzsche, Fichte, and H.S. Chamberlain's Foundations of the 19th Century, which revolves on race. We were the first to think of translating Mein Kampf. Whoever lived during this period in Damascus would appreciate the inclination of the Arab peoples to Nazism, for Nazism was the power which could serve as its champion, and he who is defeated will by nature love the victor. The British would respond to the coup with force, but they would need time to mobilize, so they called the Zionists to man a special commando squad. They recruited Irgun commander David Raziel out of Acre prison to conduct operations to sabotage Iraqi oil refineries, as well as to kidnap or assassinate Amin al-Husseini. Raziel was killed on May 20th, 1941, by the Luftwaffe near Habaniya. The British would land forces at Basra in mid-April, while Jordanian troops entered Iraq by land from the west, successfully toppling Rashid's regime by the end of May. However, Rashid's supporters would lash out against their neighbors as the regime fell. Loyalist soldiers, along with local mobs, would incite a pogrom against the Jewish community of Baghdad. The Jews of Baghdad had learned in these 2 terrible days that they were completely at the mercy of their neighbors and masters. They had also learned that Western governments, solicitous for good relations with these same masters, would do little or nothing to help them. Needless to say, the lesson was not lost on the masters themselves. This incident led to the Haganah setting up a secret cell in Baghdad, and during a mission escorting English troops out of Iraq in 1942, Moshe Dayan was recruited to secretly deliver several suitcases full of handguns to the Baghdad cell of Haganah. After the Iraqi coup was dealt with, the British decided they needed to deal with Lebanon and Syria, which were still controlled by Vichy France. As part of the operations, the British enlisted the Palmach to scout ahead of regular forces, taking out communications infrastructure. Involved in this operation was future Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who scouted ahead of an Australian division. As the youngest, I was given the job of climbing up the telephone poles, only to find that the pole was held upright by tension of the wires. The pole swayed, and I found myself on the ground. Moshe Dayan was attached to the same scouting group that Rabin was, and it was in this mission that he lost his eye in a shootout with Vichy soldiers. But as the British were mopping up Axis supporters in the Middle East, they still had to deal with actual Axis forces in North Africa. At the start of the war, German interests in North Africa were almost entirely constrained to the Suez Canal, hoping to cut the British Empire in half by capturing it. But by the fall of 1940, the Axis were losing in the Mediterranean, when Admiral Raeder convinced Hitler that North Africa and the Middle East were a vital theater of the war, painting a picture of German forces capturing the Suez and then moving north through the Levant, pressuring the Turks to join their side against the Russians. Britain's initial confidence was shaken by the German blitz across Europe, and then the fall of France, which saw France create a DMZ along its borders with Libya and Africa. The Germans would then reinforce the Italians in North Africa with 2 divisions under the command of Erwin Rommel. Despite this, the Egyptian government, a nominal ally of Great Britain, refused to declare war on Germany or Italy, despite the Italian Air Force bombing Alexandria. With the recent example of Iraq undoubtedly on his mind, King Farouk of Egypt was privately hoping for a German victory and providing intelligence to the Axis powers. In private correspondence with German ambassadors, he would praise Hitler's greatness and openly praise Nazism in a meeting with James Roosevelt, the son of US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And King Farouk wasn't the only one in Egypt covertly supporting the Nazis. General Aziz al-Masiri, a former member of the Young Turks and the Committee of Union and Progress, would recruit a spy ring in Egypt to deliver intelligence to the Germans. Amongst his recruits were future Egyptian presidents Gamal Abdel Nasser and Anwar Sadat, the latter of whom would form the Free Officers Organization that would eventually lead the coup against King Farouk in 1952. While working with al-Masiri, Sadat would form ties with the Muslim Brotherhood via its spiritual leader, Sheikh Hassan al-Banna, both of whom sought to overthrow the Egyptian government. Sadat had several aborted attempts at overthrowing the government in 1941, which involved trying to start a fight between Egyptian and British troops that he hoped would escalate into a broader revolution. Al-Misri would ask Sadat and the Free Officers for help in escaping Egypt in May 1941, in hopes of aiding Rashid expel British forces from Iraq. He would get caught by the British when his plane crashed, which would lead to Sadat's first arrest due to his ties to al-Masiri and al-Banna, but he would be released from custody due to a lack of evidence. 1942 would be the turning point of the war in both Europe and North Africa, but not before the Axis made one final push. The British asked King Farouk to replace his Prime Minister, Hussein Siri Pasha, with the parliamentary majority leader, El Nahas, which Farouk initially refused, until a show of force by the British surrounding the royal palace with tanks. But this triggered demonstrations in Alexandria and Cairo in support of Rommel, while the Free Officers began preparing for a revolt, while Sadat met with German agents. Erwin Rommel would capture Tobruk in June of 1942, which set the British into a panic in Egypt, evacuating their officials by train to Palestine and destroying their diplomatic documents in the embassy in Cairo. The Jewish Agency also began evacuating Jews from Egypt, all the while the ultra-Orthodox Jews of Alexandria, who didn't support Zionism, prepared to make deals with the Arabs. The British felt so desperate during the summer of 1942 they actually allowed the Jewish Agency to cooperate with Arab loyalists, who built a joint weapons store near Jalud. The Haganah continued to build new settlements across Jewish-owned land, establishing the Yavneh kibbutz, as well as another settlement called Durut, 10 miles east of Gaza. The agency began to build a series of fortifications in the Judean hills, which were part of the Carmel Plan, which involved relocating the command centers for the Yishuv and Haganah to these places, in order to lead a Jewish resistance to an Axis occupation. But the desperation was worse than this might envisage. The Arabs in Palestine began leaving marks on Jewish homes as a means of basically calling dibs on their property in the event that the Nazis were able to bring the Holocaust to the Middle East. And in fact, there was so much competition over potentially looting Jewish property that it caused infighting between Arabs and even murder. Additionally, the British told the leaders of the Jewish Agency that in the event of Egypt's fall, the British would pull everything out of Palestine and retreat to Persia, leaving the Jews to their fate. A meeting of Jewish leaders in Palestine came to the decision that in the event of an invasion, the elderly Jews would commit mass suicide, while the young Jews would grab weapons and wage a guerrilla war against the Nazis and Arabs. It felt as though the end of days were near, when a miracle occurred. but I would like to take a minute to thank the miracle that is my Patreon. And in particular, I would like to thank my newest patrons, John, Ernest, and Rick Sib. The patrons give this channel much needed support when the algorithm doesn't feel like giving the videos a fair shake. Members of the Patreon get access to a number of perks, such as getting early access to ad-free versions of the video, as well as access to a patrons-only Discord server. And depending on your level of membership, you also get access to the scripts and the notes I use to make these videos. But ultimately, these perks are mostly just a way for us creators to show our appreciation to you guys for supporting us, because most people choose to support creators not because they get these perks, but because they think what we do has some kind of value and they want to help us keep making more of it. So to all my patrons, past, present, and future, thank you. But for now, let's get back to the history. Erwin Rommel would be defeated by Bernard Montgomery at the Second Battle of El Alamein in July of 1942, which led everyone to give a sudden sigh of relief. And with the military threat to Palestine gone, the British felt less need to accept the aid of the Zionists and resumed their policy of appeasing the Arabs, which the Nazis would do as well. For years, the Nazis had a weird relationship with the Arab and Islamic worlds. On the one hand, the Arabs were Semites like the Jews, but on the other hand, they had a strange respect for Islam, in particular, its many anti-Jewish tracts. The argument is sometimes put forward that the Arabs cannot be anti-Semitic because they themselves are Semites. Such a statement is self-evidently absurd, and the argument that supports it is doubly flawed. First, the term Semite has no meaning as applied to a group as heterogeneous as the Arabs or the Jews, and indeed it could be argued that the use of such a term is in and of itself a sign of racism and certainly of either ignorance or bad faith. Second, anti-Semitism has never anywhere been concerned with anyone but Jews, and therefore available to Arabs as to other people as an option should they choose it. A great deal of modern writing about Jews in the Arab lands and in other parts of the Islamic world might suggest they have indeed chosen this option. The Nazis would treat the Arabs differently from other Semites, and the Arabs didn't really seem to care that Jewish immigration to Palestine was largely being driven by Nazi persecution. And the Arabs themselves were ripe for anti-Allied propaganda. Conspiracism was, and to this day is still, rampant in the Middle East. They believed the varied and contradicting promises made to the leaders of the Great Revolt and the Zionists were part of a singular, coherent conspiracy to defraud the Arab people. The creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine was a conspiracy the British either allowed to happen or active participants in, and depending on who you ask, the King of Jordan was involved as well. They believe the Zionists have deeply infiltrated governments around the world, forcing them to support the creation of a Jewish state from within. Some of the more excessive of these conspiracy theories about the role of European Jewry in shaping European policy towards Palestine stretch believability to the breaking point, of course, but the fact remains that actual historical events and widely accepted explanations for them often form the foundations of more radical conspiracies. They had a tendency to view every foreigner as a secret Jew, and behind every secret Jew was a conspiracy to dominate the Arabs. Eisenhower notes this mentality amongst the Arabs of North Africa in his 1948 memoirs, Crusade in Europe. The country was ridden, almost ruled by rumor. One rumor was to the effect that I was a Jew, sent into the country by the Jew Roosevelt, to grind down the Arabs and turn over North Africa to Jewish rule. The political staff was so concerned about this one that they published material on me in newspapers and in special leaflets to establish evidence of my ancestry. It's also worth acknowledging that Arab culture of the 1940s wasn't exactly what we would call democratic, and they saw no inherent moral value in the systems of government or justice of the Allied powers. Combine that with the popular view that Britain was the protector of Zionism in spite of the white paper and everything else they would do afterwards, and the Arabs were very susceptible to Nazi propaganda. And to help them with that was a man for whom much of the world saw as a representative of the Arab cause. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, had fled the Palestine Mandate during the revolt and set up a court in exile in Beirut, where he was subsequently placed under house arrest by the French. But in October 1939, he fled his confines in Lebanon, disguised in a dress, and made his way to Baghdad, where he allied with Prime Minister Rashid's pro-Nazi coup. But after the coup was put down by the British and Jordanian forces, the Mufti fled to neighboring Iran. But after the British and Soviets invade and occupy Iran in August of 1941, he flees to Turkey, and then to Rome to meet with Mussolini. In his meeting with El Duce, he claimed to have been the head of a secret pan-Arab organization and offered to join the Axis if Italy and Germany promised to recognize a fascist pan-Arab state. Mussolini was open to the idea, but Hitler would be more difficult to persuade, so the Mufti would try to flatter Hitler into support of the Arab cause. The great political and military triumphs, which the Führer has just achieved through his foresight and great genius, the Arab nation everywhere feels the greatest joy and deepest gratification on the occasion of these great successes. The Arab people confidently expect the result of your final victory will be their independence and complete liberation. They will be linked to your country by a treaty of friendship and collaboration. The Mufti wanted Italy and Germany to issue a joint statement in support of his cause, which would see numerous drafts, just for it to ultimately be shelved until German forces had broken through the Caucasus. He would finally get to meet with Hitler on November 30th, 1941, and attempted to convince him to sponsor a pan-Arab revolt, led by him. Of Germany's victory, the Arab world was firmly convinced, not only because the Reich possessed a large army, brave soldiers, and military leaders of genius, but also because the Almighty could never award the victory to an unjust cause. The Führer restated his hesitancy, but in consolation, he would make Husseini the official spokesman for the Arab world in the Third Reich. He promised to issue private letters to both him and Rashid, promising to recognize and support the independence of Arab states. He also promised the Mufti that he would destroy all the Jewish settlements in Palestine. The Mufti would take his role as spokesman for the Arab world very seriously, placing the best spin on the Reich's policies to suit the Arab world. He would also work on recruiting a Muslim division of the SS composed of Bosnians and various Soviet Muslims, which was created after Winston Churchill announced the creation of a Jewish brigade. And the Mufti's participation in Nazi anti-Semitism wasn't merely performative. One of the most prominent facets of the Jewish character is their exaggerated conceit and selfishness, rooted in their belief that they are the chosen people of God. There is no limit to their covetousness, and they prevent others from enjoying the good. They have no pity and are known for their hatred, rivalry, and hardness, as Allah described them in the Quran. Many sources will try to write off Arab support for the Nazis as little more than realpolitik, but the anti-Semitism of the Nazis had a distinct appeal to the Arabs, so much so that Nazi race ideologists began to advocate amending their racial categorizations of the Arabs. A German diplomat even suggested having future editions of Mein Kampf edited to replace references to Semites with Jews. These proposals were ultimately all rejected by Hitler. After all, Hitler was still Hitler, who had once said of the Arabs that they are half-painted apes who want to feel the whip. But these attitudes didn't stop Arab nationalists from wanting to emulate the Nazis in the Middle East. Attempts at forming an Arab Nazi movement began in the early 1930s, but the German consulate in Jerusalem was uninterested at the time. Arab leaders praised the Nuremberg Laws in 1934, and Arab fascists set up their own paramilitary youth organizations modeled on the Hitler Youth, such as the Syrian Popular Party and the Young Egypt Society. And as German forces neared the Caucasus, Nazi propaganda reached a crescendo, with the Mufti granting it legitimacy. In this war, the Arabs are not neutral. They cannot be neutral. If, God forbid, England should be victorious, the Jews would dominate the world. England and her allies would deny the Arabs any freedom and independence, would strike the Arab fatherland to its heart, and would tear away parts of it to form a Jewish country whose ambition would not be limited to Palestine but would extend to other Arab countries. But if, on the contrary, England loses and its allies are defeated, the Jewish question, which for us constitutes the greater danger, would be finally resolved. All threats against the Arab countries would disappear, millions of Arabs would be freed, and many millions of Muslims in Asia and Africa would be saved. The Mufti and much of the Arab world would get what they wanted from the 1939 White Paper, even if they refused to endorse it, and their view of the Jews who made new homes for themselves in Palestine reflected those of their Nazi allies. According to Nazi doctrine, Jews were alien and hostile murderers in Europe because they belonged to another race, different from that to which most Europeans belonged, inferior, and therefore hostile. Prior to resorting to war and systematic genocide, the Nazis attempted to rid themselves of Jews by making life for them so bad in Germany that they chose to leave of their own accord. And Palestine was just as good as anywhere else they could be sent to, with 19% of those who fled in 1933 choosing the Levant, with a total of 52,000 going there by 1939. This was done through the Havara Transfer Agreement, negotiated between the German government, the Zionist Federation of Germany, and the Jewish Agency. In exchange for transferring their assets to the German government, Jews would be allowed to emigrate to Palestine. Obviously, the Zionists didn't support any of what the Nazis were doing, and in no way could their actions be described as the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It was to save the lives that were literally and directly threatened by the Nazis. But depending on what parts of the internet you go to, you may hear another claim that Jewish fascists or Jewish Nazis, known as the Stern Gang, were allied with the Nazis, which is also untrue. I'm going to cover the Stern Gang, or as they refer to themselves as Lehi, a little later in the video, but here's the short version. After Jabotinsky ordered the Irgun to work with the British to fight the Nazis, one of its leaders, Avraham Stern, broke off and formed his own group, Lehi, in order to continue the armed struggle against the British. At some point between 1941 and 42, Stern drafted a proposal for an alliance between Lehi and the Nazis to drive the British out of Palestine so the Zionists could establish a Jewish state. This is all true, but there are a few points to be understood. First, the proposal never made it past the written phase. It was never delivered to Hitler or any German official. Instead, it was found amongst the documents of Avraham Stern after his death, so he never acted on it. Second, Lehi was an incredibly tiny organization, an offshoot of an offshoot, which operated on the fringes of Jewish society and was opposed by mainstream Zionist leadership. Contrast that with Amin al-Husseini, who was not only the highest-ranking Islamic religious figure in Palestine, but was internationally recognized as the sole legitimate voice of the Arabs of Palestine. In fact, when you look at the three major Zionist militias, the Haganah, the Irgun, and Lehi, the only one that at no point collaborated or considered collaboration with the Nazis were the Irgun, who are the political ancestors of the Likud party, but that's a story for another time. And for their part, the Nazis didn't support Zionism, believing the creation of a Jewish state was part of a global Jewish conspiracy to control the world. But the Nazis were okay with letting Jews leave for Palestine, believing that shrinking the Jewish population of Germany would make it stronger and better able to fight the Jewish conspiracy later. There was also the added benefit of reducing international criticism of Hitler's government, giving his targets a chance to live elsewhere instead of forcing them to suffer in the Reich. It is good that Jews from Germany came to Palestine and spent their fortune here. Palestine is a suitable place for German Jewish immigration. They will not take root there. Their fortunes will be spent and the Arabs will liquidate them. The Jews in Palestine are doomed. Their end will be to leap from the frying pan into the fire. There were some Nazis who tentatively supported the creation of a Jewish state, but only in hopes that it would hasten the exodus of Jews from Germany. Adolf Eichmann was among these rare Nazis, until he secretly visited Palestine in 1937 during the calm of the Peel Commission's investigations. But when he observed the desolate landscape, he concluded that there was no way enough German Jews could be pressured to move there. Although Hitler still believed Palestine was useful as a magnet to draw away some Jews, it was around this time that the Nazis began to believe that forced relocation was the only solution to the Jewish problem. However, German support for Jewish emigration to Palestine collapsed after the publication of the Peel Report in 1937, which made it appear that a Jewish state would be created in the near future. There is a greater German interest in maintaining the dispersion of Jewry. Even when no member of the Jewish race is settled on German soil, the Jewish problem will not be solved for Germany. Rather, the developments of recent years have shown international Jewry will necessarily always be an ideological and therefore also a political enemy of National Socialist Germany. The Jewish question is thus one of the most important problems of German foreign policy. Although eradication of the Jews had always been a goal of the Nazis, the practical on-the-ground policy of the final solution didn't become a thing until after the invasion of the USSR in 1941, with the Einsatzgruppen rounding up and slaughtering Jews and dumping them into mass graves. The policy of death squads and camps would be solidified by the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, including the usage of the term final solution. And here is where I need to talk about the Mufti again, because depending on how deep you look into this online, you may hear some people claim that Amin al-Husseini gave Hitler the idea for the final solution. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel has repeated this claim numerous times, and I've heard others repeat this claim to me in the comment sections of numerous videos. And they're probably in the comment section of this video here, but I'm here to tell you that it's not true. But it's not something that Netanyahu or the Israeli right just made up. In fact, this myth dates all the way back to the Nuremberg trials. You see, there was an eyewitness who claimed to have seen the Mufti visit Auschwitz. This witness was Dieter Wislency, who was an aide to Adolf Eichmann at the camp. And he claimed that Husseini had given the idea for the final solution to Hitler. Now, this claim has two glaring flaws. Firstly, genocide was on the Nazi agenda long before Hitler became Chancellor in 1933. The terminology used may have been different, but the concept of killing a bunch of Jews was well established. The Nazis didn't need to be convinced of this. Secondly, this claim was denied by Adolf Eichmann himself during his 1961 trial in Jerusalem. Eichmann is also one of the sources where we get the 6 million figure for Jewish deaths in the Holocaust. Now, that's not to say that the Mufti wasn't involved in the Holocaust at all, far from it. He definitely knew about it. In a radio broadcast in September 1944, he makes a reference to there being 11 million Jews left in the world, while the pre-war estimate was about 17 million. This is an oddly specific number considering the man in charge of Auschwitz was giving the 6 million figure for Jews killed in the final solution. So not only does that mean that Husseini probably knew about it, this also means that Vislenski's story is probably correct, with Husseini probably getting those statistics from Adolf Eichmann himself. And unlike other Arab collaborators of the Nazis, Husseini never denied knowing about the Holocaust. After the war, the Mufti would spend the rest of his life saying that the Jews were killed in revenge for betraying Germany during the First World War. This is what's known as the stabbed in the back myth, and although it is historically false, it is a non-trivial part of the motivations of both the Nazis and the Germans in general. Additionally, he played an active role in sending Jews to Auschwitz. Throughout the war, he would send letters and messages to the leaders of minor Axis powers, discouraging them from allowing their Jews to emigrate. In place of that, he suggests sending them to Poland by train. And so, no, the Mufti did not give Hitler the idea for the final solution. He was just a big fan of it. The British government began to learn about the final solution in spring of 1942, with at least 1 million Jews having been systematically killed by that point. And despite this, still decided to restrict immigration to Palestine by all practical means. The US government would also clamp down on all efforts to try and rescue Jews, believing the money raised to do so might fall into the hands of the Germans or alleviate them of legal responsibility to care for its citizens. The Allied governments tried to clamp down on news of the Holocaust, publicly and privately writing it off as atrocity propaganda, like the stories of Germans melting down humans to make soap in the First World War. After the British made their public announcement about stronger enforcement of the White Paper, a Zionist conference was held at the Biltmore Hotel in New York. David Ben-Gurion, Chaim Weizmann, and all the Zionist organizations in the US attended the conference, debating how to respond to the British, resulting in an official statement adopted in October 1942, which became known as the Biltmore Program. The New World Order that will follow victory cannot be established on foundations of peace, justice, and equality unless the problem of Jewish homelessness is finally solved. The conference urges 1. That the gates of Palestine be open to Jewish immigration. 2. That the Jewish Agency be vested with control of immigration into Palestine and with the necessary authority for upbuilding the country, including the development of its unoccupied and uncultivated lands. 3. That Palestine be established as a Jewish commonwealth integrated into the structure of the new democratic world. The conference also votes to approve violence, if deemed necessary, to secure the right of Jews to immigrate to Palestine. The Jewish Agency would hold its first meeting discussing the Holocaust in November 1942, publishing its first official acknowledgement on November 23rd. When the news of the Holocaust reached Arab communities, they either doubted the reports or were unsympathetic. A Christian Arab journalist, Khalil al-Sakakini, mocked the Jewish Agency's proclamations of mourning, with the agency's intelligence reports suggesting that at least 60% of the Arabs supported the Nazis. In February 1941, a poll conducted by the American consulate in Jerusalem found that 88% of Palestinian Arabs supported Germany. One of the last opportunities to save a large number of Jews came in March of 1944. Secret talks between a Jewish rescue committee and Adolf Eichmann saw the Nazi offer Hungary's 800,000 Jews in exchange for thousands of trucks with tons of coffee and soap. This offer, colloquially known as the Bloods for Goods offer, was rejected by the Allies, with the first trains delivering Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz setting off in April, with over 400,000 being sent by July.
There is no doubt that this is probably the greatest and most horrible crime ever committed in the whole history of the world. That it has been done by scientific machinery, by nominally civilized men in the name of a great state and one of the leading races of Europe. It is quite clear that all concerned in this crime who may fall into our hands including the people who only obeyed orders by carrying out the butcheries, should be put to death after their association with the murders has been proved. It is quite possible that rich Jews will pay large sums of money to escape being murdered by the Huns. It is tiresome that this money should get into the hands of ELAS. We should take a great responsibility if we prevented the escape of Jews, even if they should be rich Jews. I know it is the modern view that all rich people should be put to death wherever found, but it is a pity that we should take up the attitude at the present time. After all, they have no doubt paid for their liberation so high that in the future there will only be poor Jews, and therefore have the ordinary rights of human beings.
The Hungarian Jew who delivered this offer to the Allies was so angry at their rejection that he would join Lehigh in their war against the British authority in Palestine. I must have tried 1,000 times since 1939 to explain to myself, let alone to others, just how and why it happened that during the very years that the British stood with so much courage and determination against the Nazis, they were also able and willing to find time, energy, and resources to fight so long and as bitter a war against the admittance of Jewish refugees from the Nazis to Palestine. In addition to rejecting the Hungarian offer, the Foreign Office rejected an offer made by the Bulgarian government to allow Jews to safely pass through their territory and leave by sea if they were headed to Palestine. If we do that, then the Jews of the world will be wanting us to make a similar offer in Poland and Germany. Hitler might well take us up on such an offer, and there simply are not enough ships. Hitler would be sure to sneak his agents into the group. The blocking off of all legal routes into Palestine is why the Haganah, and to a lesser extent the Irgun, all engaged in operations to smuggle Jews into Palestine even before the final solution. After the white paper was published in 1939, the Jewish Agency concluded that the goal of statehood couldn't be a long-term aim, and thus they needed to increase the Jewish population of Palestine or face extinction. The Jewish Agency had orchestrated illegal immigration prior to the white paper, and after they would task the Haganah with it, who would create the Mossad to handle these operations. However, despite the war effort, the British would put more resources into policing immigration into Palestine than any time prior. And between 1939 and 1948, the Haganah would purchase 60 ships in their attempts to break this blockade. Most of these ships were small, filthy, and overcrowded, setting sail from ports in the Balkans, especially the Black Sea. Initially, when the British stopped a ship, they would try to deport the refugees back to the port of origin. But when this appeared impossible, they began to pressure these governments to prevent their setting sail in the first place, threatening to reduce the immigration quota from those countries to the UK in retaliation. The British government even turned down an offer from Italy made before their entry into the war to help the immigration of Jews from Germany and Austria. The illegal migrants were dealt with harshly by the British. This was partly out of fear that Nazi agents may have been among their ranks, but it was mostly to dissuade refugees from trying to flee Europe. Illegal immigrants caught in Palestine would be held in camps at Sarafand and Atlit, but those caught on ships had a more dangerous fate. At first, they tried deporting them back to Europe, but as more and more of the continent fell to the Nazis, this option faded. So they decided to detain them at camps in Mauritius, but they would have to be delivered by sea. After capturing a refugee ship, they would often unload them from that ship and onto another waiting to set sail for Mauritius. In late November 1940, one of these ships, the Patria, would be targeted by the Haganah, who planted bombs. The intent was to damage the ship just enough so the British would have to delay its departure to repair it. But the bombs would do far more damage than anticipated, sinking the ship and killing 250 refugees. To save face, Winston Churchill would allow the survivors of the attack to be detained on land in Palestine rather than be sent to a penal colony in the Indian Ocean. However, the policy of detaining captured refugees outside of Palestine would be applied to all future ships, with the addition of extra camps in Cyprus. But the Patria incident wouldn't stop the Zionist efforts. The Jewish Agency would meet with people in Ankara with contacts to the Zionist underground in Poland, hoping to have food, money, and weapons delivered to them. And Turkey would be a major hub in the Underground Railroad, bringing Jewish refugees to Palestine. A year after the Patria incident, a ship carrying 800 Jews arrived in Istanbul, with the British pressuring the Turks to send them back to Romania. In February 1942, the Turkish government forced this ship, the Struma, to be towed away from shore, but about 5 miles offshore, with all of its passengers on board, it would sink and become another embarrassment for the British government. And this would be far from the last rickety old ill-repaired ship carrying Jews to sink. In summer of 1943, the British government would change its policies on Jewish refugees, allowing any who reached Turkey on their own to be given a visa for Palestine. However, the British weren't the only ones not being helpful to Jewish refugees. The US refused a proposal to allow Jews in occupied Europe to flee through Spain into North Africa. And President Franklin Delano Roosevelt wouldn't authorize the War Refugee Board to begin negotiating asylum for minorities persecuted by the Nazis until January 1944. Its only success during the war was allowing the migration of a few thousand Soviet Jews living in exile in Turkey. And the Mossad didn't just aid European Jews during the war. Between 1942 and 1943, they helped 4,000 Jews from Iran and Iraq flee to Palestine. There are countless stories of these refugees trying to flee to Palestine during the war, but ultimately very few lives were saved, somewhere between 16 and 20,000, most of whom the British were aware of when they arrived and were thus deducted from the 75,000 total new migrants the Jews were allowed to bring in under the White Paper. And most of the refugees detained in camps in Mauritius and Cyprus would remain there until 1948. For the Haganah, resisting the White Paper by simply flouting its restrictions was enough, but for the revisionists, mere disobedience was insufficient. But the revisionist movement wouldn't agree on what kind of resistance was acceptable. And to better understand this, we are going to need a brief history of the various Zionist militias in Palestine. Jews in the Ottoman Empire formed self-defense organizations in the late 19th and early 20th century, which became the foundation of the Haganah in 1920, with the intent to defend Jewish communities from violence from their Arab neighbors, especially after the Nabi Musa riots that began Amin al-Husseini's rise to power. In its early years, the Haganah, similar to the Yeshuv and the Jewish Agency, was dominated by labor Zionists, but a new form, called revisionist Zionism, was pioneered by Zev Jabotinsky, which believed the labor Zionists weren't insistent enough upon the creation of a Jewish state. The division eventually led members of the Haganah, under the leadership of Avraham Tahomi and other officers, to split off in 1931. Initially, they called themselves Haganah B, but they broke up in 1937 over differences of how to respond to the Arab revolt in Palestine. Some of the Haganah B members would rejoin the original Haganah, but others would become more explicitly revisionist, forming the Irgun. The Irgun was initially focused on enacting retribution against the Arabs for violence committed against Jews. Our goal was not so much to punish as to deter, to warn and to raise the price of each Jewish life taken or damaged. Reprisals were not acts that called for or elicited celebration. They had to be and were part of the payment demanded from us for national survival, and I recall them as such, without apology or regret. Numerous future Israeli politicians, including two prime ministers, such as Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, had been members. Of course, the same can be said of numerous Haganah members, such as Levi Eshkol, Yitzhak Rabin, and Shimon Peres. In 1939, the Irgun was headed by David Raziel, with Avraham Stern as his lieutenant. But the Irgun would become internally divided when Jabotinsky announced that the revisionist movement should make a truce with the British in order to fight the Nazis, which held out until he died in August 1940.
Our grievances against the mandatory government are not forgotten, but first, the Nazi rattlesnake must be disposed of, and afterwards our rights in Palestine and elsewhere will be re-established.
In 1941, Avraham Stern, with his followers, would split off from the Irgun to form Lehi in order to continue fighting against the British, while the Irgun lent its services to British operations in Iraq. Like many of the revisionist movement leaders, Stern had been born in Poland and immigrated to Palestine after World War I. The Polish government had covertly supported the revisionists, setting up training camps for the Irgun on Polish soil, hoping a Jewish state would entice Jews to emigrate. In 1941, Stern wrote a manifesto, The Principles of Rebirth, calling for a renewed action against the British, as well as defining the borders for a future Jewish state. Just a quick tangent here, but the claimed borders of Israel have varied depending on political faction. The Haganah, and subsequently the Israeli left, had always narrowly defined the ideal borders of Israel to encompass the Palestine Mandate, and later redefined it to the borders after the Six-Day War. The Irgun, and thus later the Israeli right, would define the ideal borders of Israel, encompassing the entirety of the Palestine Mandate, as well as the Kingdom of Jordan. This additional claim of territory was based on the original borders of the Palestine Mandate, which until 1922 included Jordan. The Likud party maintained this as the true borders of Israel until 1993, when, under Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership, they narrowed their claims to just the Palestine Mandate as it was in 1948. Well, those weren't the borders, according to Stern and Lehi. Lehi was a religious Jew who believed World War II was the fulfillment of the Gog and Magog prophecy of chapter 38 of Ezekiel. In the Principles of Rebirth, he used Genesis 15:18 to define Israel's divinely ordained borders as given to Abraham. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." Since October 7th, an image of a patch allegedly seen on the uniforms of IDF has been floating around the internet. Now, the veracity of this image has been dubious, but real or not, the borders shown on it are likely taken either from Stern or from the same passage in Genesis where Stern got his borders from. Yitzhak Shamir, who had worked in the Irgun as a trainer for their youth organization, National Cells, would follow Stern over to Lehi. Shamir and much of the Lehi membership was arrested in early 1942, with Stern himself killed in a shootout with British police in February, by which point Lehi was on the brink of extinction. The atmosphere was very Middle Eastern and rather lax. The camp administration made few demands on us, and there was virtually no abuse or ill treatment. Under most other colonial regimes, prison life, though it might have been easygoing on the surface, was basically different, with cruelty, persecution, and provocation never far off. But this was not so at the time in Palestine. Shamir would escape from prison in 1943 and help rebuild Lehi after Stern's death, becoming one of its leaders until 1948. They would establish new cells across Palestine, as well as international cells in Czechoslovakia, the UK, the US, and Egypt. Lehi's militant activism would become a threat to both the Irgun and the Haganah, not just because it triggered a crackdown by the British against all Zionist militia groups, but also because they recruited from the same pool of angry young Jewish men who wanted to do something about the white paper. To win back some of the momentum for themselves, in addition to the genuine outrage by the British shutting off the borders to Palestine to Jewish refugees, the Irgun would declare war on the British in 1944, which is where we need to cover the story of Menachem Begin. Begin was born in 1913 in what is today Brest, Belarus, but at the time was part of the Russian Empire, but became part of Poland in 1919. As a student, he joined Betar, the youth wing of the revisionist movement, and participated in the paramilitary training, with the expectation that he would eventually join the Irgun. Begin himself was a great admirer of David Raziel, who hoped to serve under him once he got to Palestine. But after the Nazis and Soviets invaded in 1939, he and much of the Betar movement were rounded up by the Red Army, where he was sent to several Soviet labor camps near the Arctic Circle. I was one of many, of thousands and scores of thousands engulfed in the sea of destruction and sorrow which had drenched Europe, from west to east, when the Nazis let loose their desire towards world domination and the destruction of the Jewish people. Begin would be released from captivity when Stalin ordered the creation of a Soviet-backed Polish army after the German invasion of 1941. Stalin would offer to send 3 of these Polish divisions to Palestine in order to free up British troops, which Churchill accepted in spring of 1942, which is how Begin would make his way to Palestine by May, traveling across the Caspian Sea, through Iran, Iraq, and Jordan. Upon his arrival in Palestine, he discovered that David Raziel had been killed a year earlier in Iraq, and so threw himself at the new head, Yaakov Merodor. Like most Zionists, Begin was angry at the British policy on Palestine, especially after learning about the ongoing Holocaust. One cannot say that those who shaped Middle East policy at the time did not want to save the Jews. It would be more correct to say that they very eagerly wanted the Jews not to be saved. The average Englishman was probably indifferent to Jewish lives as any other non-Jew in the world. But those who ruled Palestine in the Middle East were not in the least indifferent. They were highly interested in achieving the maximum reduction in the number of Jews liable to seek to enter the land of Israel. Irgun had fewer than 50 full-time operatives, which made it easy for someone like Begin to be appointed the head of the High Command, with Merodor's arrest in winter of 1944 leaving Menachem as the de facto head of the Irgun until his return in 1948. It was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April 1943 that put the Irgun's declaration of war into motion. Both the labor and revisionist movements had been involved in organizing that revolt, but the much larger Haganah would cover up the revisionist involvement in their propaganda. Additionally, the British crackdown after Rommel's defeat at El Alamein saw the roundup of hundreds of Haganah members and weapons caches. Begin wrote the Proclamation of Revolt in 1943, but the leadership of Irgun debated whether or not to issue it early or wait until after they had already conducted major attacks on British authorities. In August of 1944, the Irgun would attack several police stations between Tel Aviv and Jaffa, which would be followed by their formal declaration of war against the British. It was the British, by their decisions and actions on immigration, who ultimately determined the course of events in Palestine and who, because they refused to save the Jews of Europe in the time of that great ordeal, earned for themselves the profound hostility of people like myself. It wasn't a question of hating. Not all wars require hating. Both Lehi and the Irgun were involved in the targeting of British officials. However, the Irgun limited themselves to only targeting police and administrators of Palestine, whereas avoiding hitting anyone in the military or anything else that could be hampering the war effort against the Nazis. Lehi, on the other hand, held no such restrictions, and its actions would condemn Zionism in the eyes of many British administrators. I didn't feel anything, not even a little twinge of guilt. We believed the more coffins that reached London, the closer the day of freedom would be. Winston Churchill had been a supporter of Zionism since the 1920s, and had joined the Labour and Liberal parties in criticizing the 1939 White Paper. But even after he became Prime Minister in May 1940, he wasn't able to reverse course on Jewish migration to or land purchases in Palestine. This made governing the Mandate more difficult, with the head of the government actively opposing its own policy. Under Chamberlain, the government had restricted Jewish activity in order to appease the Arabs, and although most of these ministers were replaced upon Churchill's ascension, their replacements were on the same page policy-wise. He was one of the biggest supporters in recruiting a Jewish unit to help fight, but he was unsuccessful in convincing many of his cabinet ministers, including members on the ground in Palestine.
I do not consider that proper use is being made of the large forces in Palestine. The essence of the situation depends on arming the Jewish colonists sufficiently to enable them to undertake their own defense, so that if necessary, for a short time, the whole of Palestine can be left to very small British forces.
Opposition to arming the Jews went beyond mere strategic considerations. There was a deep-seated anti-Semitism amongst the foreign affairs and armies around the world, and the UK was no exception. I loathe the lot. Why should we be afraid of saying we hate them? It's time this damned race knew what we think of them. Loathsome people. But prior to Chaim Weizmann's visit to the US in 1942, Churchill told him of a plan to resolve the conflict between Jews and Arabs by creating a Pan-Arab Federation, headed by King Ibn Saud, while giving the entirety of Palestine to the Jews.
I would like to see Ibn Saud made Lord of the Middle East, the boss of the bosses, provided that he settles with you. It will be up to you to get the best possible conditions. You might talk it over with Roosevelt when you get to America. There's nothing he and I cannot do if we set our minds on it.
This idea was first conveyed to Churchill by John Philby, a British Arabist who was a close friend and sometimes advisor to the King of Saudi Arabia. The plan was for Britain to give Saudi Arabia an annual payment of £20 million in exchange for Saudi Arabia resettling all the Arabs of Palestine within their borders, with the added bonus of Ibn Saud being made the head of a pan-Arab state. It was under this scheme that the Morrison Committee took up the task of trying to resolve the Palestine conflict, which saw tentative interest from Ibn Saud. However, neither side was willing to fully commit to the idea unless the other side endorsed it publicly first. The committee would resurrect the idea of partition abandoned after the Woodhead Report, which faced opposition from both the colonial and foreign offices. In early 1944, General Hastings Ismay tried to scuttle the partition proposal by claiming it would foster Jewish resentment, which Churchill eviscerated in a letter to the general.
The chiefs of staff seem to assume that partition will arouse Jewish resentment. It is, on the contrary, the white paper policy that arouses the Jewish resentment. The opposition to partition will come from the Arabs, and any violence by the Arabs will be countered by the Jews. It must be remembered that Lord Wavell has stated that, left to themselves, the Jews would beat the Arabs. There cannot therefore be any great danger in our joining with the Jews to enforce the kind of proposals about partition which are set forth in the ministerial paper. I therefore cannot accept in any way the requirements for internal security set out in the table, which proceeds upon the assumption that both the Jews and the Arabs would join together to fight us. Obviously, we shall not proceed with any plan of partition which the Jews do not support.
It was after the Morrison Committee endorsed partition that Churchill was finally willing to establish a Jewish battalion in July of 1944. By early 1945, a 3,400-man Jewish brigade was sent to Italy to serve alongside the British 8th Army.
I like the idea of the Jews trying to get at the murders of their fellow countrymen in Central Europe, and I think it would give a great deal of satisfaction in the United States.
One of the veterans of the Jewish brigade, Mordecai Gershon, would witness the effects of the Holocaust firsthand and send reports of it back to the Jewish Agency in Tel Aviv. After the war, he would become part of Nakam, a special unit of the Haganah tasked with hunting down Nazi war criminals. On November 4th, 1944, Churchill meets with Weizmann again, encouraging the Zionists to accept partition even if the exact borders were not to their liking. He also condemns the ongoing terrorism in Palestine by Lehi and the Irgun, and asks that the World Zionist Organization and the Jewish Agency clamp down on them. He also advises Weizmann to meet with Lord Moyne, whom Churchill assures has had a change in heart since his time as colonial secretary. Remember when we put that pin in Lord Moyne earlier? Well, now's the time we take that out. Lord Moyne had been a strong opponent of Zionism at the beginning of the war, and had done everything within his purview to prevent the creation of a Jewish military unit. And like many foreign affairs officials of the era, he had a conspiratorial view of Jews. In a speech to the House of Lords in June of 1942, Lord Moyne went on a tirade about the Jews not being a distinct race from Europeans, asserting that they were just a mix of Gentiles and Slavs. Statements like that would be latched onto by Arabs of that day and to this day, asserting Jews are a foreign and therefore illegitimate presence in the Middle East. On top of this, it was Lord Moyne that ordered the Turks to turn back the Struma and rejected the blood for goods deal from Adolf Eichmann, so he was deemed as a sufficient target by Lehi. By this time, Lehi had established several international cells, including one in Cairo, where Lord Moyne was stationed. The two members of this Lehi cell that carried out the attack were part of the national cells that were administered by Yitzhak Shamir. On November 6, 1944, two Lehi gunmen shot Lord Moyne to death and were arrested. The attack shocked Winston Churchill, who had been the arch defender of Zionism within the Conservative Party.
If our dreams for Zionism are to end in the smoke of assassins' pistols, and our labors for its future to produce only a new set of gangsters worthy of Nazi Germany, many like myself will have to reconsider the position we have maintained so consistently in the past.
The wavering of Churchill shocked Weizmann and Ben-Gurion, who wholeheartedly condemned the murder of Lord Moyne, and the Jewish Agency would respond by initiating the hunting season of both Lehi and the Irgun. Ben-Gurion began labeling them as fascists or Jewish Nazis, and would inform on them to the British. The agency encouraged families to inform on their relatives they believed were involved in terrorism, and created a small civil war within the Jewish community of Palestine. Despite the Haganah now hunting down the Irgun, Menachem Begin refused to cease anti-British operations, nor would he authorize retaliation against the Haganah, refusing to fire on another Jew. And this infighting made a number of Haganah members uncomfortable. I hated it. I could control my envy of the militants and didn't mind the steps the Jewish Agency took to prevent anti-British activity. Even arresting and punishing the militants seemed reasonable enough. But turning them over to the British? How could Jews turn on other Jews? It seemed criminal, a shameful thing to be associated with. Despite the efforts of the Jewish Agency in hunting down anti-British militants, Winston Churchill would withdraw his support for partition of Palestine in March of 1945. And the British weren't the only ones that had to deal with Zionist activism. Jews were a crucial component of President Roosevelt's electoral coalition in the northeastern United States, and to secure their support, Roosevelt had told Jewish congressmen that he would get Churchill to rescind the white paper after the war. The 1944 Democratic platform even included a plank supporting Zionism.
We favor the opening of Palestine to unrestricted Jewish immigration and colonization, and such a policy as to result in the establishment there of a free and democratic Jewish commonwealth.
But support for Zionism was bipartisan, with the Republican Party's platform also voicing its support.
In order to give refuge to millions of distressed Jewish men, women, and children driven from their homes by tyranny, we call for the opening of Palestine to their unrestricted immigration and land ownership, so that in accordance with the full intent and purpose of the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and the resolution of a Republican Congress in 1922, Palestine may be constituted as a free and democratic commonwealth. We condemn the failure of the President to insist that the Mandatory of Palestine carry out the provision of the Balfour Declaration and of the Mandate while he pretends to support them.
And these bipartisan endorsements of Zionism were preceded by lobbying from both domestic and foreign advocates of Zionism. One of the leading voices supporting Zionism in the US was Rabbi Stephen Wise, who broke from the consensus of Reform Judaism to adapt Jewish customs to the culture of their home countries. Alongside him was Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, whose abrasive personality and tactics contrasted with the more conciliatory Wise, who was better liked by the Democratic administration, with Silver being accused of being a closet Republican. Wise had focused on trying to win policymakers to the Zionist cause, while Silver pursued a more populist strategy, trying to win over non-Zionist Jews and then the wider American public. The Roosevelt administration didn't like Silver, who had a habit of working with the Republicans, who utilized Zionism as a wedge issue against the Democrats. The two would join forces in 1939 by forming the American Zionist Emergency Council, or AZEC. And although these activists were mostly aligned with Weizmann and Ben-Gurion, the Irgun were also active in the US. After Jabotinsky had been banned from returning to Palestine by the British, he would travel to America in early 1940 to rejuvenate the revisionist movement, after the invasion of Poland wiped out its main base of operations. He died shortly after visiting a Batar summer camp in upstate New York that was attended by the future Minister of Defense, Moshe Arens. After Jabotinsky's death, a member of the Irgun, Hillel Kook, came to the United States to reorganize the revisionist movement. Kook would change his name to Peter Bergson in order to appear more American and enacted his own campaign for fundraising and advocacy. He even recruited journalist and playwright Ben Hecht to write and produce numerous pro-Zionist stage plays and a traveling show, which included a young Marlon Brando among its actors. Bergson's strategy was to set up a bunch of separate organizations that were focused on different aspects of the conflict, such as rescuing Jews in Europe, smuggling Jews into Palestine, or procuring arms and money for the Irgun, so that non-Zionists who still supported saving Jewish lives could aid the cause alongside those who wanted to establish a Jewish state. But Bergson did not get along with the AZEC, the World Zionist Organization, or the Jewish Agency. Bergson would go so far as to purchase a former embassy building in Washington, D.C., with his Zionist organization, the Hebrew Committee of National Liberation, declaring itself the government in exile of a future Jewish state. In addition to domestic agitation, foreign advocates, such as Chaim Weizmann, would lobby the Roosevelt administration. Back in 1940, rumors of persecution of Jews and other minorities by the Nazis was treated as warmongering propaganda in the US, with President Roosevelt unwilling to make any commitments. Weizmann visited again in 1941 in order to explain the delay in the creation of a Jewish fighting force to American Zionists, as well as to report back to Churchill about the extent of anti-British propaganda in American media. He finds that both President Roosevelt and Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles are supportive of the Zionist cause, but he would discover that there was a big disconnect between the president and the American public on one side and the State Department on the other. The US State Department had to deal with Zionist lobbying directly, as well as indirectly, with activists going directly to the US congressmen who would give public speeches and declarations in support. This led to the State Department having to put out fires overseas and assure Arab governments and notables that these politicians didn't speak for the Roosevelt administration. And when asked to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration in 1942, Secretary of State Cordell Hull gave a speech that de-emphasized its Zionist nature. Of all the inhuman and tyrannical acts of Hitler and his Nazi lieutenants, their systematic persecution of the Jewish people, men, women, and children, is the most debased. The Jews have long sought a refuge. I believe that we must have an even wider objective. We must have a world in which Jews, like every other race, are free to abide in peace and in honor. In 1942, Harold Hoskins was sent to the Middle East to investigate popular and government attitudes there. And in 1943, he delivered a report that claimed war was about to break out between Jews and Arabs in Palestine. In his report, Hoskins claims that Ibn Saud told him that Chaim Weizmann tried to bribe Saudi Arabia to betray the Arabs of Palestine, and that he had banned John Philby from entering the country again. However, when Weizmann met with Philby himself in 1943, he contradicted all of Hoskins' claims, saying that he was still on good terms with the king. And here we get one of the most fun yet frustrating parts of doing history: contradictory sources. Earlier in the video, I told you about a plan Churchill had in resolving the Palestine conflict by paying Ibn Saud to resettle Arabs of Palestine within Saudi Arabia. My best guess is that Hoskins heard this story and either extrapolated that it must have been Weizmann trying to bribe Ibn Saud, or Ibn Saud must have lied to Hoskins in order to sow discord between the US government and the Zionists. Either way, the State Department had the excuse it wanted. In order to justify redirecting U.S. policy away from Zionism, the State Department would work with a small handful of anti-Zionist Jewish organizations, such as the American Jewish Committee, led by Joseph Proskauer. In addition to the State Department, the U.S. oil industry, as well as American missionary societies working in the Middle East, also tended to be anti-Zionist, due to Arab governments holding private actors responsible for what their home governments did. Since the State Department tended to use these groups as informants on the situation in the Middle East, they held a lot of sway. This information led the State Department to believe that no Jewish state was possible without an armed conflict with the Arabs, and they were convinced that the Zionists couldn't secure a military victory without the armed forces of the US or Britain. And so the State Department and administration began speaking of a national home or commonwealth for the Jews as being separate and distinct from that of a Jewish state, hoping to placate the Arabs by saying the Jews just wanted to live in Palestine but not exercise any political power. But as the war was coming to a close and President Roosevelt's life neared its end, he would give one last push to try and secure a Jewish state in the aftermath of the war. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, FDR met with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, but at no point were Jewish refugees brought up in the open discussions. In private, he gets the impression that neither Churchill or Stalin are openly opposed to Zionism, and when asked what he would give to Ibn Saud in exchange for a Jewish state, Roosevelt jokingly says that he would give him America's 6 million Jews. After Yalta, Roosevelt would meet with King Saud, ostensibly to secure access to Saudi oil for American companies, but he would insert the Jewish refugee issue into the talks. FDR had a pretty high opinion of himself, believing that he could single-handedly resolve the Arab-Jewish conflict. He planned to convince Ibn Saud to let the Jews have Palestine by showing him a map of the Middle East and pointing out how small Palestine was in relation to the rest of the region. He also tried to resurrect many of the same arguments about the benefits of Jewish immigration on the standards of living of the people of Palestine that the Jewish Agency had been trying to convince Arabs of for the past decade. His new Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius Jr., was a more ardent Zionist than his predecessor, Cordell Hull, writing in his diary, "Palestine should be for the Jews and no Arabs should be in it," and he has definite ideas on the subject. It should be exclusively Jewish territory. However, the State Department made sure to appoint as many opponents of Zionism into the president's orbit as it could.
If America should choose in favor of the Jews, who are cursed in the Quran as enemies of the Muslims until the end of the world, it will indicate to us that America has repudiated her friendship with us.
The meeting between FDR and Ibn Saud eventually occurred, and the king was intractable as the president's advisors had warned him. When he brought up the issue of Jewish refugees, King Saud became upset, insisting that Jews be given land from the Axis powers instead, proclaiming that Jews and Arabs could never work together as equals in any country. When he returned home, the president would admit defeat both privately and publicly. King Saud wrote off every accomplishment of the Zionists, proclaiming that Arabs would rather be poor and independent than live as equals with Jews. At this point, FDR begins to discourage the Zionists from trying to create a state, believing that such a state couldn't survive, and the process of trying to do so would result in a second Holocaust. Weizmann's impression was that Ibn Saud and other Arab leaders weren't willing to compromise with the Zionists because they believed the Western powers' support for the Jews was weak. On April 12, 1945, less than a month before the final surrender to the Nazis, FDR would die. It would be up to his vice president, Harry Truman, to finish the job in Europe and the Pacific, and the State Department began working on Truman early, hoping to deter him from moving on the Palestine issue. I was skeptical about some of the views and attitudes assumed by the striped pants boys in the State Department. It seemed to me that they didn't care enough about what happened to the thousands of displaced persons who were involved. It was my feeling that it would be possible for us to watch out for the long-range interests of our country while at the same time helping these unfortunate victims of persecution to find a home. Back in Europe, the UK held an election after the surrender of Germany on May 8th. By this point, the Conservative Party had already withdrawn its support for Zionism, despite the Labour Party still keeping it a plank of their platform. But after their victory, Clement Attlee and the Labour government would keep most of Churchill's policies in regards to Palestine, realizing their dependence on Arab oil necessitated good relations with Saudi Arabia and Iraq. There were millions of displaced persons in Europe after the war, and even amongst them the Jews were the most detested. The UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration would house Holocaust survivors next to German refugees, which created obvious tensions. When they polled the Jews, it was discovered that over 96% of them wanted to be resettled in Palestine, but the British resisted American pressure to let them, which only led to an increased effort by the Jewish Agency to smuggle them in. And just because the Nazis had been defeated didn't mean the prejudices that made the Holocaust possible were purged from the Western heart.
Others believe that the displaced person is a human being, which he is not, and this applies particularly to the Jews, who are lower than animals. We entered the synagogue, which was packed with the greatest stinking mass of humanity I have ever seen. Of course, I have seen them since the beginning and marveled that beings alleged to be made in the form of God can look the way they do or act the way they act.
As the war came to an end, the post-war international community was organizing, including in the Middle East, where the Arab League was established, consisting of the independent Arab states of Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. Due to a lack of coherent leadership amongst the Palestinians, the role of legitimate representative would be taken up by the various Arab states as the need and utility arised. The Palestinian leaders that did exist tended to become more radicalized as they felt trapped between the Jews on the one side and the Arab states on the other, all of whom had different interests in the region. The League tried to get the Mufti to soften his rhetoric in order to win more support from the West, but these attempts usually revolved in him becoming even more radical out of spite. The Mufti's collaboration with Nazi Germany was, in effect, a gamble whose negative impact could not be prevented by the Palestinian national movement. The Palestinian public, who were in general politically opposed to the Allies, did not penalize the Mufti or view his activities as a reason to depose him. Unifying the Palestinians was a difficult task. They possessed the same divisions the rest of the Arab world had, such as divides between the wealthy and the poor, the urban and the rural, and the nomadic and the settled. Additionally, there were religious minorities amongst the Arabs, primarily Christians, who tended to be less enamored with the religious nationalism of most Palestinian leaders. Its pre-war leadership had been geographically scattered, but in 1944 the Arab notables would form the Palestine Arab Party, which the Husseinis managed to become the most powerful faction of, with full encouragement of the British government. Of course, the Arab League would have its own internal divisions. Each member had a veto on resolutions, which made collective action difficult, and the various states had different interests in regards to Palestine, with the Hashemite faction, led by Iraq and Jordan, opposing Palestinian nationalism in favor of Pan-Arabism. Despite these divides, the League would agree to recreate the Arab Higher Committee in Palestine, which the Mandate government had outlawed during the revolt. The new AHC would consist of various members of the Husseini family, as well as other pro-revolt factions. And the Arab League's Alexandria Protocol made clear their position on Zionism. The rights of the Arabs cannot be touched without prejudice to peace and stability in the Arab world. Second to none in regretting the woes which have been inflicted on the Jews of Europe, but the question of these Jews should not be confused with Zionism, for there can be no greater injustice and aggression than solving the problem of the Jews of Europe by inflicting injustice on the Palestine Arabs. As spring turned into summer, some refugees began to make their way home, including Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. On August 11, 1945, an anti-Jewish pogrom broke out in Krakow in response to a small number of Jews being appointed to the Polish government by the Soviets. A year later, in June 1946, another pogrom occurred in Kielce, where dozens of Jews were killed. These attacks would trigger a mass exodus of Jews from Poland towards Czechoslovakia, hoping to seek sanctuary in Palestine. The Arab rebellion of the late 1930s had been cruelly suppressed, but it had brought home to the British that compromise between Arabs and Jews was impossible. Only war would decide the issue. Whoever won would control the country, or as much of it as they could conquer. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video. To get your 14-day free trial and get your information removed from the collections of data brokers, go to aura.com/casualhistorian. I'd also like to thank the members of my Patreon for supporting the channel for another month. If you're interested in becoming a patron and getting early access to videos, as well as your name in the scrolling chyron at the end screen here, then go to patreon.com/casualhistorian to learn more. So what are your thoughts about the video? What topics would you like me to cover in the future? Leave those down in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.